The story you are about to hear may contain detailed descriptions of intense violence. It will certainly be worse than fiction.
Hello, my name is Les. Thank you for joining me as we take a look at a true tale of unimaginable horror. My daddy's all filled with blood. I have to get my brother. He was getting into the blood, but I did not let him. These are the words that a jury would hear during the trial that followed the murder of this little girl's mom and dad in 1987. Rebecca Gibson, only 5 years old at the time, managed to call 911 on Christmas Eve morning and utter those words to the dispatcher that would hear her calls for help firsthand. Most of us don't understand the true meaning of the word death at the age of 5, and I'm not sure if Rebecca did, but she knew something was profoundly wrong when she made that call. Dad wasn't moving, and he was covered with blood, but she couldn't find Mommy. The brother she was talking about, John, was only a year old when that horrifying call was made. And though he has since grown up, bereft of his parents, there may be solace in knowing that he likely has no memory of that terrible scene. Well, hopefully that's the case. This story was suggested by a listener from way back, just after the release of the first episode, so I want to thank Kristen for this suggestion, along with the source materials she provided. Still though, it's been a little difficult to put this story together. It isn't a very well-known case, and court docs aren't publicly available at this time, so it's been a slow churn sifting through what feels like hundreds of archived newspapers. I've had to scrape little bits from each one and piece together the most detailed story possible, and I wish there was more to work with, but that's just the nature of the game. I've done my best with this one, but enough rambling. Before I go any further, though, I have a podcast recommendation and a short trailer for Drunk Medical Stories.
Hey guys, it's Terry.
And old Uncle Tom.
I'm not calling you that.
You'll get used to it.
Are you wanting something a little different in your podcast lineup?
Maybe you're looking for some funny anecdotes to share around the water cooler.
Then do we have a podcast for you?
Welcome to Drunk Medical Stories, where we offer hilarity in the form of outlandish medical tales.
With the aid of medicinal beverages of the boozy variety.
This podcast is rated explicit for language and adult content.
And we do also recommend a very strong stomach, as we will be discussing the occasional graphic medical condition.
Here you will learn why you never go from zero to mango.
And get ready to hear about crazy medical stories from notorious VAG, old-timey treatments, and the good old Rectum Ralph.
Check out our Facebook page, Drunk Medical Stories Podcast.
And we are on Twitter at DMS Pod.
We are available on all the podcast apps you can find.
Check us out.
I'll put a link to their show in the notes of this episode. There is a strange phenomenon that happens very rarely in crimes. It's mostly perpetrated by females and by only a small percentage of female killers. for whatever reason, whether it be that they can't have a baby or that they've miscarried several times or due to mental illness, the fact of stealing someone else's baby to raise as your own is almost exclusively committed by women. If a male is involved, it is usually as an accomplice to please his girlfriend or wife. It is almost uniformly the female's desire, though. Perhaps they see it as something to live for, with that caretaker instinct becoming insatiable until something snaps. The line between right and wrong becomes blurred, and it becomes a matter of necessity to fill that void eating at their souls like the coming dark of night. It builds to the point of being all that person can focus on, and the obsession roots. She must have a child, by any means necessary, even if it means taking one from someone else, even if it means killing the parents of a baby to ensure success. There are many examples of this happening throughout history, but it still begs the question, how could someone go this far when there are other ways to have a child without actually giving birth? So without further ado, let's get into the topic of today's story. I hope you enjoy, if that's the right word for it. As I was talking to my wife about this case, she asked me why a handgun such as a .357 Magnum needs to exist. How did we get to the point of such a powerful hand cannon being developed? It's a pretty good question if I'm to be honest, but I was already a step ahead of her and hadn't planned on including it in this story, but I'm from a region of the country where guns are found in most homes. Hunting and fishing are high on the list of pastimes in the wooded hills of southeast Kentucky, and I grew up in gun culture. There isn't much to do in the small country towns that line the valleys down yonder. Hunting is more or less a hobby for some people, and also a way to provide fresh food sources plucked from the wildlands that still exist in the area. A large portion of the families that have survived in the beautiful foothills of the Appalachian Mountains are impoverished, and when father and son bring home a deer or a good mess of fish, it's a relief to have a great bounty of quality meats to enjoy. Now, while researching this case, I looked up the history of the .357 Magnum as I was unfamiliar with it myself, so I'll give you a brief explanation on the origins of this devastating gun and the rounds it was designed to fire. The .357 Magnum was designed in 1934 as Smith & Wesson's answer to the Colt .38 Super Automatic. Mobsters, drug runners, and bootleggers were able to render the service weapons of police ineffective by simply taking cover behind their cars or wearing crude body armor. The .38 Super Automatic was barely effective enough to pierce through car bodies and the vests worn by these criminals. But as you would expect, they would try successfully to get ahead of law enforcement and shore up the bullet-stopping power of their vehicles and armor. Enter the .357 Magnum. This was a handheld weapon that boasted a much thicker and longer barrel than standard-issue weapons, capable of firing high-powered rounds that can pierce body armor and cars, while maintaining trajectory and stopping power. Most handguns at the time would have blown apart if these rounds were fired from them, and if you've ever picked up a .357, the first thing you noticed is how heavy this chunk of precision-engineered metal is. Police needed a way to stop and neutralize the Tommy gun-toting gangsters that rose to power in the streets, without having to carry around cumbersome rifles. A collaboration from well-established gun manufacturers Smith & Wesson and Winchester gave them exactly what they needed, and since then, the .357 Magnum has remained a legendary weapon among gun enthusiasts. You might be asking yourself, Why the history lesson that I never asked for? We'll see as the story unfolds. On Christmas Day 1990, Reverend Helen Lawson, aka Mother Lawson, made a visit to the Women's Correctional Institution in Delaware, bringing an army of volunteer staff with her to prepare a Christmas feast for the inmates. Curiously enough, it was also the day that the Godfather Three premiered in theaters, but I digress. It was a tradition for Mother Lawson to host these events at the prison and others in the region. She would say, quote, "I do it because God wants me to do it. These people need to be taken care of, regardless of what they've done." Susie, a reporter for the News Journal, had recently settled in the area, secured a job with the newspaper, and tagged along to do a story about the festivities. I don't want to throw her under the bus here. She was unfamiliar with the situation, and I'm sure she had already dealt with it many years ago, so I don't want to put her real name out there. Regardless, she detailed the meal that was prepared: turkey, ham, carrots, yams, stuffing, collard greens, salad, along with desserts of cake and pie. You know, the usual menu for a grand holiday feast. Mother Lawson led the inmates in singing hymns and reading Bible verses, as she had done 17 times at this particular prison in the 30-plus years she did this kind of thing. Prisoners sang along and gave thanks for the meal provided and showcased pictures they had drawn related to the holiday. The story ran on the front page of the newspaper the next day, and in the grainy, antique-looking black and white photo attached to the article, there are 3 female inmates that look to be praying over generous plates of undoubtedly the best food they had all year in their cell. It was a feel-good story titled "A Taste of Christmas," and was a heartwarming article about a moment in time where even people who had done some bad things were given a brief moment of compassion and caring. Many of these women have spent years confined within the cold, echoey walls of the prison, away from family and friends. Mother Lawson brings a little bit of joy with her to let them know that someone cares. One inmate said, quote, "It's great because there's a lot of people who don't give a damn about us. Whether we're wrong or right, she's still here for us." Now, we could argue all day about who belongs there and who doesn't. And quite frankly, I'm of the mind that there are people in prison who committed offenses that don't necessarily warrant an extended stay in such a facility. Some, though, committed crimes that most people would consider heinous enough to require removal of that person from society for good. Mother Lawson's advice to most inmates was, quote, "Whatever you did, don't do it anymore." At the end of the article was a special section that focused on a single inmate. The header read, "Lonely time for woman convicted of 2 murders." The picture on the front page of that edition showed the image of Joyce Lynch, a woman who had been convicted of a double murder. She was on the left side of the picture, praying solemnly over the pile of food resting on her lap. Susie reported that Joyce's family always set a place for her at the dinner table since her incarceration, symbolically. Joyce lived a solitary, lonely existence in prison and expressed emotional distress during the holidays. Quote, "It hurts. It doesn't get any easier," she said. "This is the hardest time of year for me. I personally can't imagine being stripped away from my family and put into a box, with the only door to the outer world having a knob only on one side, the side I'm not on. No doubt lonely indeed, but the reason she was in prison in the first place not only closed the door for another family, it left a void in the lives of 3 young children and the other family members. Christmas time may indeed be lonely for Joyce Lynch, but for those children, it's forever stained as a reminder of when Mommy and Daddy went away for good. Loneliness isn't a strong enough word for what the Gibson family goes through every year during the most festive holiday. The family of Joseph and Beverly Gibson were no doubt shocked to see the picture of the person who was convicted of murdering them printed on the front page of the newspaper 3 years and 2 days after the crime. To read the story and see her quoted as feeling lonely and making the best of it must have been infuriating. At best, we can hope the family didn't see the article, but the reporter who wrote it learned of Joyce's crimes before turning in the story, and the paper ran the article anyway, with a small sidebar summarizing her heinous actions. Still, though, I don't think it was right to include that part of it, and it was definitely insensitive to print that picture of her enjoying a feast fit for a queen, while 3 children still wondered why their parents were gone. The paper did run an editorial a couple of weeks later, which was a self-critical examination of the story, but it was 2 weeks too late. Dover, Delaware. The capital city of the second smallest state in the U.S. also happens to be the second smallest city in Delaware. Colorful storefronts line the tidy streets that radiate an almost small-town vibe, though the population is around 40,000 today, and in the late 80s it would have been somewhere around 25,000. This small city lies in one of the original 13 colonies of the U.S. and enjoys that distinct New England charm the region is known for. Beautiful autumns, frigid, snowy winters, and warm summer days. You can experience the extremes of every season in Delaware. Christmas Eve of 1987 was unseasonably warm in Dover, with the mercury reaching up to a very comfortable 52 degrees on that partly cloudy day. Perfect weather to put on a light jacket and go out to look at the Christmas light displays that no doubt glowed blue, red, and green hues throughout the city. Just outside the borders of Dover, a few miles to the southwest, is a rural area of mostly farmland. Long, straight roads with small streets branching off in any direction lined with homes, known as Hazlettville. Joyce and Richard Lynch, residents of Houston, Delaware, were expecting a baby in 1987 according to an ad in the local newspaper. They had been married on June 7th of that year. Joyce, who was about 9 years older than her husband, was already a mother of 2 teenagers and looked forward to mothering a child with the man of her dreams. She wanted desperately to give him a baby, one that was his own, that would carry on his family name. Her previous marriage with Frank Greenwood, the father of her nearly grown kids, had fallen apart for reasons that I was unable to find, but I can imagine that it wasn't unlike other dissolved marriages. The bond was lost somewhere, there were frequent arguments, financial issues, and so on. Richard was the kind of guy who stayed out of trouble throughout his life and was well respected by classmates and friends growing up. Mitchell Harding said, quote, "He was never in any kind of trouble that I knew of. He was just one of the guys." He had a decent job at Baltimore Air Coil Company, which manufactures industrial cooling equipment. Since August of 1987, Joyce and Rick had spread the news of the baby to come with family and friends. As most families do when the birth of a little one is imminent, they prepared their home with new furniture and had stocked up on baby clothes and other necessities. In the week or so that preceded Christmas, an announcement was made that a baby boy had been birthed by Joyce, weighing a healthy 7 pounds 11 ounces. Richard was seen at a local store buying 4 cans of baby formula powder shortly after the announcement of his son's birth was made. Mabel Moore, the owner of that store, had asked him when he would bring the little boy in so she could see him, and according to her, he said, quote, "Pretty soon. He's got a cold right now." A couple weeks later, Joyce would go into the same store which the couple had frequented and paid off a $348 tab they owed. She then got a few dollars worth of gas and a pack of cigarettes wrote down on a new tab. It was nothing out of the ordinary. They were regular customers and on good terms with Mabel, so it was just another day. Mabel said Joyce told her husband, quote, "Boy, having that baby just tore my back up," while she was in the store. She remembered Joyce being clad in maternity clothing since the summer of 1987 and said, quote, "All summer and part of the winter she wore the maternity clothes, but she did not look like she was pregnant. That's what some of the other girls here said too." Almost simultaneously, the Joseph and Beverly Gibson family were celebrating the birth of their third child, Matthew, who was introduced to the world on December 15th. In the days after Matthew's birth, his grandparents, Joseph Sr. and Thelma Gibson, got 2 phone calls from a person named Dawn. She told them she had become acquainted with the Gibsons at the hospital and wanted directions to the couple's home so she could see how they were doing and visit the newborn boy. Joseph Sr. gave Dawn the address to the Gibsons' home in Hazlettville. Shortly thereafter, a neighbor of the Gibsons was approached by a woman driving a dark-colored car with pop-up headlights and asked for directions to the address she had written down. I'm unsure of what day the phone call from Dawn was made exactly, but it is undoubtedly a day that Joseph Sr. wishes he could redo and choose not to give those directions to Dawn so easily. I don't want to point any fingers at Joseph Sr. here. He was legitimately convinced that this was going to be a harmless visit to his son's family. He bears no responsibility for what happens in the sentence that I'm about to speak. Joseph Jr. was found face down in a pool of his own blood in the kitchen of their mobile home by the first responders to the scene on the morning of Christmas Eve. 2 small children were in the home, Rebecca and John. Thankfully, they weren't apparently harmed. Rebecca, at just 5 years old, had the wit and smarts to call 911 and tell them something was wrong. And if not for her bravery, who knows how this story could have ended. I've heard stories of the children of murdered parents nearly dying from dehydration or starvation because they were left abandoned at the crime scene. Rebecca, if you somehow hear this podcast, you are a hero, and you saved not only your own life, but John's as well, and perhaps even Matthew's. Ballistics testing determined that Joe had been shot at least twice, once in the head and once in the chest, with a .357 Magnum, a true handheld cannon. Beverly would be found minutes later, still wearing a nightgown in the car, sitting in their driveway. She too had suffered 2 grievous wounds delivered by the .357 and sat dead in the driver's seat. One shot had struck her in the chest and the other in her butt, likely as she was heading toward the vehicle. It's believed that she tried to escape the nightmarish situation, but couldn't get the car started in time. The ammunition used to kill this couple with 3 young children to care for were jacketed hollow points, which are horrifying to imagine being shot with. They are designed for maximum tissue damage, so as to stop a person in their tracks with a single shot. The tip of the bullet is concave, and as it carves its way into flesh, it blossoms like a macabre flower carried by the Grim Reaper and spreads out, effectively increasing the surface area of the leading edge of the projectile. Combine that with the legendary power of the .357 Magnum, and you have a devastatingly effective weapon. Even if the Gibsons were to survive the 2 gunshot wounds, the damage inflicted would have left permanent, potentially crippling effects on them for the rest of their lives. Nancy Webb, Beverly's mother, would later say, quote, "It's just inconceivable how someone could come into somebody's home and take 2 lives of the parents of 3 beautiful children. You put all that time into educating them and bringing them up, and then somebody comes and takes their life." Investigators were baffled, along with the small farm community in the area. Crimes like this simply don't happen in these quiet, sparse neighborhoods, and they had no suspects initially. What the investigators didn't know was that something was missing from the scene, though it wouldn't be long until they found out that the Gibsons had a newborn, and he was gone. Joseph Sr. would inform the investigators about the calls he had received from Dawn, and they began working to trace those calls back to their origin. Phone records took them to a home in Houston, which is about 15 miles southeast of Hazlettville, so the FBI paid the residents a visit 2 weeks after the Gibson murders on January 7th, 1988. It was Joyce and Richard Lynch who lived at the home, and the phone number that called Joseph Sr. and Thelma was registered in Joyce's name. They knocked on the door and Joyce answered and let them into the home. They saw baby toys strewn about the floor upon entry, and she informed them that she had given birth a couple of weeks prior with the help of a midwife. She introduced them to the baby and noted that he looked like her husband. One officer later said, quote, "We had pictures of that child in our squad room, and we all looked at it every day. The minute I saw him, I knew it was him. I had to wait for confirmation, but in my heart, I thought it was him." They talked for a couple of minutes and decided to come back when Richard came home. At around 5 p.m. that day, Richard arrived and the investigators went back to the home and asked them if they would go down to the police station for some questioning, to which the Lynches agreed. They loaded up in their black Pontiac Firebird, which matched the description given by the Gibsons' neighbor, and headed out. While at the station, the baby's footprints were taken and compared against Matthew Gibson's footprints. I bet you can guess where this is going, huh? Indeed, they were a match. Matthew had been found unharmed and apparently well cared for by the Lynches. Relatives of the Gibsons had no hope that Matthew would ever be found. He must have been hundreds of miles away by this point in their eyes. Richard informed police that his wife was pregnant in June when they got married, despite the fact that she had a partial hysterectomy some years before. She was examined in August of 1987, and a sonogram was performed which revealed that she was not pregnant. Joyce gave them only the last name of the supposed midwife, and upon investigation, agents determined that there were no midwives practicing in Delaware by that name. Investigators brought in relatives of the Lynches and learned that Joyce had recently visited 2 hospitals and, quote, became upset because the babies in the nursery were unattended too long and too subject to theft. Many of Joyce and Richard's family members believed that she had in fact been pregnant and didn't suspect that she could have been involved in the senseless murder of Joseph and Beverly Gibson. They were told that the baby, which they named Richard Lynch III, was born on the evening of December 23rd. Joyce and Richard would endure 14 hours of interrogation, and by the end of it, they were both charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, unlawful imprisonment, burglary, conspiracy, and possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony. Within hours of being charged, they made an appearance in court for a bail hearing, and formal charges were filed. The death penalty was immediately on the table. Joyce maintained that it was all Richard's plan and that he was the one who killed the Gibsons. A search warrant was obtained and investigators combed their property. In Joyce's purse, police found a piece of paper detailing directions to the Gibsons' home. Richard voluntarily handed over, wait for it, a .357 Magnum revolver and a box of hollow point ammunition. 4 shells were missing from the box. In a bag found inside their home, they discovered another note with directions to the Gibson home and 3 spent .357 Magnum shell casings. There is no known link between the Lynch and Gibson families, and Matthew's birth wasn't announced publicly. How the Gibson family was targeted by them remains a secret that only Joyce and Richard knows. At least, I've been unable to find any further information about it. During the trial that followed, both Joyce and Richard would point the finger at the other, and prosecutors were seeking the death penalty for both. Ultimately, Richard was acquitted of all charges, but Joyce was found guilty of all charges. She would not be handed a sentence of death, however, instead given life in prison for her crimes. I wasn't able to obtain full court documents on this case, so I can only speculate on how it ended like this. Richard was certainly guilty of something here, I'm sure, but Richard is a free man and was remarried in 2010. He has a Facebook profile and updated his profile picture in October 2019. Joyce remains imprisoned in a cold cell somewhere in the country. She was initially housed in the Delaware Women's Correctional Institution, but at some point she was transferred and I wasn't able to find where she was moved to. Thelma, the Gibson kids' grandmother and caretaker, died in 2017 at the age of 87 and was able to see the kids grow well into adulthood. This amazing woman, as well as Joseph Sr., who died in 1999 at 72 years old, took her grandchildren under her wing immediately after the death of her son and daughter-in-law and played an amazing role in their lives. Under her watch, the Gibson children grew up well and have lived the best life they possibly can as far as I've found. John and Matthew reside on a 71-acre farm just southwest of Dover, and it looks like Rebecca is engaged to be married and may still be employed with the Delaware State Treasurer Administration. They seem to be doing well, and it's good to see that they've been able to grow up to be fine adults. I wish them all the best. That'll do it for episode 8. I want to thank you for listening, and if you found the show interesting, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen and tell a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to help a podcast grow. So if you know someone who's into true crime podcasts, send them a link to the show or tell them about it. I'll be forever grateful. So until you hear from me again, goodbye.